She said it on Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen doorway, holding the sketchbook she thought I hadn't noticed. It was 7 a.m. The apartment was doing the thing it does at that hour, the specific quiet of rooms that remember being louder. The light through the window was thin and November pale, and it caught her at an angle that made her look like someone arriving rather than someone who had been here all weekend. And she stood in the doorway, and she said it very quietly, almost to herself, as though she had been carrying it for a long time and it had simply slipped out before she could stop it. I heard it. She knew I heard it. And for a moment, neither of us moved, because what she had whispered changed the weight of the air in the room, and neither of us was certain, yet, what to do with a room that felt different. I am going to tell you what she said. But first I need to tell you about Sophie, because nothing that happened that weekend makes sense without her, and because Sophie is not a person I will ever tell a story around. She is the story. Everything else grew in the space she left. My name is Ethan Marsh. I am 34 years old. I build and restore acoustic guitars. Not a factory job. A one-at-a-time workshop in the back of the apartment, where the wood dust settles on everything and the air smells like spruce and lacquer and the small, careful patience that comes from shaping things by hand. I am good at this work. I have always been good at the kind of things that require you to be quiet for a long time and pay attention. I am less good at the other kind. The kind where you are meant to be a person in a room full of other people and function as though the world still makes as much sense as it used to. Sophie Marsh was my wife. She died 2 years ago, in March, from something that arrived without warning and took her in 4 months. She was 31. She was a high school art teacher who left paint on every doorknob in our apartment and could not eat breakfast without music playing, and once convinced me, at a flea market, to buy a blue ceramic mug that was slightly lopsided and chipped at the rim, because, she said, it had character, and character was more important than symmetry. She used that mug every morning for 3 years. It is still in the cabinet. I have not used it. I have not put it away. It occupies a specific middle distance between keeping and letting go, which is also where I live most of the time. I loved her completely. I want that stated plainly because what comes next requires it as foundation, not as contrast. Lena Kessler was Sophie's younger sister. She was 29. She worked in botanical illustration, scientific publications, field guides, the kind of precise, quiet drawing that requires you to look at a single leaf for an hour and notice things about it that most people would never see. She carried a sketchbook the way other people carry a phone, always present, always within reach, soft at the spine from use. She drew in it constantly, waiting rooms, train platforms, the corner of someone else's kitchen while the kettle boiled. She drew the way she observed, carefully, without performance, as though the act of looking was itself a form of respect. Sophie and Lena were not alike. Sophie filled rooms. Lena noticed them. Sophie was the one who spoke first, laughed loudest, made plans with the commanding warmth of someone who assumed you'd say yes. Lena was the one who listened, who arrived slightly late with something useful, who left without making you feel she had gone. I had known Lena for 5 years, the full duration of my marriage, and the year of dating before it. She had been at the wedding. She had been at the hospital. She had been at the funeral, standing beside me when I couldn't stand on my own. Her hand on my arm with the specific steadiness of someone who was also breaking, but had decided to break later, privately, on her own time. In the 2 years since, we had maintained a careful, warm, grief-adjacent friendship. She called on the hard days, Sophie's birthday, the anniversary, the ordinary Tuesdays that were sometimes worse than the marked ones. She never asked how I was doing in the way that required a performance. She asked what I had eaten, whether I had been in the workshop, whether the spruce I'd ordered had arrived. Practical questions. Safe questions. The kind of questions that let a person be honest without having to be brave. She had come for the weekend because she had a work meeting in the city on Monday, a publisher reviewing her plates for a field guide, and the apartment had a guest room, and it was easier than a hotel, and we were the kind of people who could share a space for 3 days without it meaning anything it wasn't supposed to mean. That was the understanding. Friday evening was simple. She arrived at 6 with her bag and the sketchbook, and a bottle of wine that she set on the counter with the ease of someone who knew where the counter was. I made pasta, one of 3 meals I make competently, and she sat at the kitchen table and drew while I cooked, and neither of us filled the silence with anything unnecessary, and the apartment felt, for the first time in a long time, like a place where 2 people lived. I noticed this. I filed it away. I did not examine it. We ate. We talked about her field guide, a project on native grasses that required the kind of detailed observation she was built for. She talked about the particular challenge of drawing something that most people consider unremarkable and making it visible, which is a sentence I thought about for longer than she probably intended. She washed the dishes. I dried. She handed me the blue mug, Sophie's mug, which she had used for the wine because it was the first one she reached for, and when I took it, my hand paused on it for a moment. And she saw this, and she said nothing, and I put it away, and the evening continued as though nothing had happened. Something had happened. Something small. The mug had been used by someone for the first time in 2 years, and the world had not ended, and I did not know what to do with that information. Saturday morning I woke to the sound of the kitchen radio. Sophie had always played the radio in the kitchen, a specific oldies station, the kind that played songs from decades neither of us had lived through, but that she loved with the uncomplicated affection of someone who believed all good music had already been written. I had not turned it on since she died. I didn't turn it off either. It sat on the counter like the mug, present, unused, occupying the middle distance. Lena had turned it on. I stood in the hallway and listened for a moment. Something from the 60s, brass and warmth, and the specific optimism of a song written before anyone in this apartment was born. And then I walked into the kitchen and she was standing at the stove making eggs with the sketchbook open on the counter beside her. And she looked up and said, "I hope the radio is okay." She always had it on. I said, "It's okay." She looked at me for a moment with the even, careful attention she gave to things she was not yet ready to say anything about. Then she went back to the eggs. We ate breakfast with the radio on. It did something to the room that I was not prepared for. It made it feel inhabited in the old way, the way it had felt when Sophie was in it. Not because Lena was replacing her, but because sound has memory, and the apartment remembered what it was like to have music in the morning, and it leaned into it the way old buildings lean into the shapes they were made for. I washed the dishes. She dried. We had reversed, without discussing it. I said, "What are you drawing?" She looked at the sketchbook, which was open to a page I couldn't see. "The view from your kitchen window," she said. "The light is good in here in the morning." I said, "Sophie said that." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "She told me." That sentence did something quiet to the room. Saturday afternoon she sat in the living room with the sketchbook, and I worked in the workshop, and we occupied separate spaces in the same apartment, with the ease of 2 people who understood that proximity does not require performance. I could hear her moving occasionally, the soft sound of a page turning, the specific silence of someone looking at something with attention. These were not dramatic sounds. They were the sounds of a person being present, and I had forgotten what that felt like. And I noticed it the way you notice a change in temperature, not suddenly, but with the accumulating awareness that something is different. At 4 o'clock, she appeared in the workshop doorway, the sketchbook under her arm, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair where she kept them when she wasn't using them. And she said, "Can I watch?" I said, "It's not interesting." She said, "I draw leaves for a living. My threshold for interesting is very specific." I said, "Fair." She sat on the stool by the window and drew while I worked on a neck joint, and we didn't talk for 40 minutes. And it was the most comfortable 40 minutes I had spent with another person in 2 years. She drew the workshop. I could see her eyes moving between the page and the room, cataloging details with the patient discipline of someone whose entire professional life is noticing things other people walk past. I did not ask to see the page. She did not offer. The privacy of it felt important. At some point she said, without looking up from the sketchbook, "You talk to the wood." I said, "I do not talk to the wood." She said, "You do." Quietly, "You say things like 'come on,' and there you go when the joint fits." I had not been aware of this. "That is professionally embarrassing," I said. She said, "It's not. It's..." She stopped, looked at the page. "It's how Sophie talked to her students, when they got the brushstroke right. She used to say 'there it is' under her breath." The workshop was very quiet. I said, "You noticed that?" She said, "I notice things." And then, more quietly, "I've been noticing things for a while." I looked at her. She was looking at the sketchbook. Her pen had gone still. She did not elaborate, and I did not push, because some sentences are not finished yet, and the worst thing you can do is make someone explain one before they're ready. Saturday evening was harder. We opened wine. We sat on the couch with the distance of one careful cushion between us. She asked about Sophie, not the death, not the grief, but Sophie herself. What she was like in the mornings, what she argued about, what made her laugh until she couldn't breathe. I told her. I told her about Sophie's commitment to the radio station, about the paint on every doorknob, about the time she rearranged the entire workshop because she had decided the light was wrong, and she was right, and I never moved anything back. I told her about the mug and the flea market and how Sophie had held it up and said, "This one. Look at it. It's trying so hard," and I had loved her for that sentence. For being a person who could see effort in a ceramic object and find it moving. Lena listened to all of this with the even attention she gave to everything, present, unhurried, taking it in without trying to shape it. And when I finished, she said, "She would be furious that you haven't used the mug." I looked at her. She said, "She would. You know she would. She'd say it was a mug, not a monument." I started to laugh, not because it was funny, exactly, but because it was so precisely accurate that it bypassed every defense I had. And I laughed the way people laugh when something true catches them off guard. And Lena laughed too, and for a moment we were two people sitting on a couch, laughing about a woman who had picked up a lopsided mug at a flea market and said it's trying so hard, and the laughter was not at Sophie's expense. It was in her language, in her register, in the exact frequency she would have used herself. The laughter faded. The room was quiet. Lena looked at me. I looked at her. Something was in the room that had not been there before, or had been there for a long time, and had simply, over the course of this weekend, stopped being avoidable. She stood up. She said I should sleep. The meeting's early. She picked up the sketchbook from the coffee table, quickly, holding it against her chest, and she said good night, and she went to the guest room. And I sat on the couch for a long time in the quiet of an apartment that had just remembered, for the second time in 2 years, what it felt like to have someone in it. Sunday morning, 7 a.m. The kitchen. I was making coffee, Sophie's mug in the cabinet, my mug on the counter, the radio off because I had not yet turned it on, and was thinking about whether I should, when she appeared in the doorway. She was holding the sketchbook, not under her arm, in front of her. The way you hold something you are about to show someone, or the way you hold something you are using as a shield. I could not tell which. She looked at me. She looked at the sketchbook. She took a breath that I could see her take, the specific breath of someone collecting themselves before something they cannot take back. She said, very quietly, "I keep drawing you. I've tried to stop." And then she stood there. The kitchen was completely still. The coffee maker was the only sound, the low, thoughtless hum of a machine that does not understand what is happening around it. I looked at her, at the sketchbook held against her chest, at the reading glasses pushed up into her hair, at a woman who had spent an entire weekend sitting in my kitchen and my workshop and my living room drawing, and who was now telling me that the subject had not always been the window or the workshop or the grasses. I said, "How long?" She said, "A year." A pause. "Maybe longer. I don't know when it started being you instead of everything around you." She looked down at the sketchbook. "I didn't come this weekend because of the meeting. The meeting is real, but I could have stayed at a hotel. I came because I wanted to be here, with you, in the rooms where she was. Because that's where you make sense to me, and She stopped. "I know who she was to you. I know who she was to me. I know this is." I said, "Lena." She looked up. I said, "You can say it. Whatever it is, you don't have to protect me from it." Her eyes were bright. She said, "I'm not protecting you. I'm protecting her. I don't want this to be something that diminishes what you had. I would rather carry this alone forever than let it do that." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. I set the coffee down. I crossed the kitchen, slowly, until I was standing in front of her, close enough that the sketchbook between us was the only distance. And I said, "Can I see?" She looked at me. Her fingers tightened once on the cover. Then she opened it. I turned the pages, past the grasses, past the kitchen window, past the workshop tools. And then, there I was, drawn from the angle of the kitchen table, drawn from the doorway of the workshop, drawn in the careful, precise pencil lines of a woman who notices things other people walk past. My hands on a guitar neck, the back of my head at the stove. My profile in the morning light that she had said was good. She had been drawing me the way she drew everything, with patience, with attention, with the quiet respect of someone who believes that looking carefully is itself a form of honesty. I closed the sketchbook. I looked at her. I said, "Sophie would not be diminished by this. She didn't move." I said, "You know her. You know she wouldn't." She would say, "I stopped, because my voice did something I hadn't expected, and I waited for it to come back." She would say, "The mug is not a monument." I looked at her. She would say the same thing about me. Lena's breath caught once, just once. I said, "You don't have to carry this alone. You never had to." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she lowered the sketchbook, slowly, deliberately, setting it down on the counter beside her so that it was no longer between us, and she said, "Okay," quietly, the way she said everything that mattered. "Okay." I reached out and took her hand. She held it. The radio was still off. Neither of us turned it on. The kitchen was quiet, and it was enough. And it was the right kind of quiet. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of two people deciding, carefully and with full knowledge of what it cost, to be present with each other. Then her phone buzzed on the guest room nightstand, audible through the open door, and she looked toward it and said, "That's my mother." And then, after a pause, "She's going to ask about the meeting." I said, "What are you going to tell her?" She said that the light in the kitchen was good. A pause. "She'll understand." I said, "Will she?" Lena looked at me with the smallest, most careful smile, the one underneath all the others. "She's been waiting for me to say something for about a year," she said. She was Sophie's mother, too. She knows what matters. That hit harder than I expected. 2 months later, she moved her work things into the apartment. Not dramatically. Gradually, the way she did everything, with patience and attention, and the refusal to be careless about something that mattered. Her illustration desk went by the workshop. Her sketchbooks accumulated on the shelf beside my templates. The apartment absorbed her the way good spaces absorb the people who belong in them, without straining, without rearranging, just making room. I used Sophie's mug on a Tuesday morning in January. I made coffee in it and drank from the chipped rim and set it on the counter, and Lena was at her desk and did not comment, and I did not need her to. The mug was a mug. Sophie would have said so. The radio was on. It usually is now. A year later, when people ask about us, and they ask carefully, because the math of it requires care, I say, "She came for the weekend." Which is true in the way that the most important things are true, completely, and without explaining everything. What I don't say, because it is ours, that she stood in a kitchen doorway at 7 a.m. and told me the truth about a sketchbook in the quietest voice I have ever heard a person use. That she was ready to carry it alone forever rather than let it touch what Sophie and I had built. That this, her willingness to lose, her refusal to diminish, was the thing that made it safe to love her. Not safe because it was easy. Safe because she understood the cost. What Lena says when she talks about it, that she loved Sophie first. That loving me was never separate from that. That the two feelings lived in the same place, grew in the same soil, and that she spent a year trying to pull one up, without disturbing the other, before she understood that they were the same root system. Sophie's painting supplies are still in the hall closet. Her name is still on the mailbox label. The doorknobs still have traces of paint on them, in colors she mixed herself, and I have not cleaned them, and Lena has not asked me to. They are not monuments. They are just the marks of someone who lived here, and who was loved, and who would have wanted the kitchen radio on, and the mug in use, and the apartment full of the kind of quiet that means someone is paying attention. I didn't fall in love with Lena Kessler on a Sunday morning in November. I fell in love over 40 minutes of silence in a workshop, over a Saturday evening on a couch, over the sound of a page turning in the next room, over a year of phone calls that asked me what I'd eaten instead of how I was feeling. I fell in love with a woman who drew me from the kitchen table with the same care she gave to a single leaf, slowly, precisely, with the belief that looking carefully at something is itself a way of loving it. She was right. The sketchbook is still on the counter. She still draws in it. Sometimes I look over her shoulder, and sometimes it's a grass, and sometimes it's the workshop, and sometimes it's me, and she no longer closes it when I come near. I asked her once why she drew me before she ever told me. She said, "Because drawing is how I understand things, and I was trying to understand why every room you were in felt like the right room." I said, "Did you figure it out?" She said, "I'm still drawing." That was enough. That was the whole answer. What would you have done if someone you trusted stood in your kitchen and told you they'd been carrying something they were afraid would hurt you? And have you ever loved someone so carefully that you almost talked yourself out of saying it? Not because you didn't mean it, but because you meant it too much. Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.